Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and on location. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I'm part of Gestalt IT, and for each episode, we bring you the opinions and perspectives of a group of IT luminaries in the space. We have a great lineup of guests today, and I'd like to take a moment for them to all introduce themselves before we jump into the premise of today's episode, starting with JD.
Hey folks, Jonathan Davis here, or JD. You can find me on Twitter at subnetwork, or my blog is at subnetwork.me.
My name's Rita Younger. I'm a practice lead for data center networking. You can find me on Twitter at SDN_girl, and my blog site is totalpackets.com.
Hello, my name is Bruno Wallman. You can find me on Twitter at WallmanBruno, and my blog site is brunowallman.com.
Harold Clute, IT infrastructure architect, currently on sabbatical. Find me on Twitter or website, just first and last name.
Hey, I'm John Herbert, Mr. Tugs on Twitter, and blogging occasionally at movingpackets.net.
Yeah, I'm Taryn Bryson. You can find me on Twitter at SomeClown, and you can find me on the interwebs wherever tech people will let me scribble words for them.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into the premise of today's episode. We don't have to tell you that network monitoring is important. In fact, we've been telling you that probably at least the last 10 years. You need to have something in your environment that's telling you what's going on. Whether it's something traditional like What's Up Gold that uses things like SNMP, or maybe something a little bit more advanced that uses SNMP and APIs, we've pretty much solved that problem, right? And then we found ourselves in the situation that we're in today, where everything's moving to the cloud. A lot more of our resources are being utilized in places that are not inside of our internal network. SNMP strings don't work in Amazon, and we need to know the analytics behind everything else going on out there, not just what our switches are reporting for port utilization. So the premise for today's episode is that traditional network monitoring tools can't keep up with modern environments. So I'm going to open this up to our folks here who wants to jump in and tell me why your traditional platform that you have relied on for so many years and is a comfortable sunk cost for your company is suddenly out of date.
I'll jump in here first and get the ball rolling. I probably have the least to say. I think as soon as we began adding overlays onto our networks, and as soon as we began building technologies on top of technologies, the problem that developed is we no longer information like port status and as you said, SNMP strings, states kind of stopped mattering as much because it was often higher level application that was actually dictating, is that up or is that down. I actually saw this once where we had all of our physical links were up. Everything was operating as you would expect. The application, on the other hand, however, was making a decision that one link in particular was having a problem due only to a slightly higher latency than had been previously experienced on that link. It was in the order of 20 milliseconds, as opposed to 8 or 10 milliseconds. So the problem is we're making decisions on so many different aspects of our environments that simple state no longer applies.
Well, I think that that's a very valid point. The technologies that we're using now are super advanced, even inside the network. We're not just dealing with something simple anymore. I can remember trialing tools back before I left the world of the reseller, where we were having to create our own kind of special monitoring system to be able to pull data that we thought really was important. And we're like, oh, well, there's not an OID for that. Okay, crap. And that was 8 years ago. And now we find ourselves in a world where I need to know why one of my transit providers has gone down. And when everything lives in Amazon, and as we saw earlier in 2021, when everybody came back on January the 5th, and one of Amazon's transit gateways decided to take a bath, the next thing that we know, Slack went down for, 9 hours because of quirkiness. But if we have the right network monitoring tools, or in this case, analytics tools, not just network monitoring, we can see that come up. So do we need to ensure that we have visibility outside of our own little bubble?
I think if we look back, so wind the clock back to 1990s, when you're cranking up your single server and your copy of What's Up Gold to monitor everything, and you've got your monolithic application where everything runs on the one server and everything's great. Then what do you need to monitor? Well, you need to know if the server's up and the switch port's up, and you can maybe ping it, and that's probably all you need to know, and your application's up. But that's not how applications are written now, right? we don't run monolithic apps. We have things that have a huge number of dependencies on other services that chances are you virtualized your application in the first place. Chances are if it's in the cloud, you're reliant on a whole bunch of services that aren't even under your control. And those dependencies mean you're now responsible for trying to monitor your application dependencies as well as your application itself. How on earth are you going to do that from something that just monitors whether a port's up or whether you can ping an endpoint? None of that is sufficient to give you a status on whether or not your application is either up or is performing well, or how the user is experiencing your app right now. And that just means that our traditional way of monitoring a network, which is just the underlay carrying packets back and forward, really has very little relationship to how an application performs or whether it's actually even offering service to users right now.
John, you're absolutely right. Networks have changed, applications have changed dramatically, with agile methodology. Tom made the statement, everyone's moving to the cloud. Well, actually, the number of micro data centers is expected to quadruple by 2025, which means we have on-premise, we have the micro data centers, and we have the public cloud providers that are also hosting our data to monitor. And doing it using containers, it's very different today. And look at the cost of downtime. The cost of downtime to an application, that's a real cost to the business. It's not just getting the application back up and running, it's the cost to the reputation. It's the cost to fix it. So there's a lot at stake today. So we absolutely need to have visibility. That visibility needs to be simple and it needs to be automated.
Well, and I would say too that one of the failings in monitoring tools of the past was that they catered to silos. So in other words, you had your network monitoring tool, you might have an application monitoring tool, you might have, et cetera, right? We had different tools. We had, the security, we had the SIM or the, SOAR that the SOC would use. So we have all these different things. And the reality is when you look at, whether it be the micro data centers or you look at stuff in the cloud, you look at, whatever, your apps, not only, are they disparate, scattered all over the place, have, multiple dependencies, in a lot of cases on other SaaS applications that live in other clouds, perhaps. But now you've also got a very complex network underlay, overlay, whatever, however it is. You've got, network trends, you've got VPC transits, you've got, stuff happening in on-prem. And those are dependencies. So now you've got network dependencies that are, scaling across multiple types of data centers. So if you're looking at only network or only application, you're missing, potentially a large portion of what the problem is, which, then leads to people throwing a flaming bag of whatever over the wall to the next, silo, like we all love.
And I think that that's an important point, Taryn, because we do have a siloed mentality of infrastructure for years. I mean, you got the storage team, you got the network team, you got the server team. And as we've started migrating things to cloud, those teams, of course, have kind of been unified together. But I think that the real driver is something that Rita discussed, is the application, because we don't think about what we're doing anymore as an atomic unit of devices, like it's the switches or the routers or the firewalls. We think in applications because that pulls in a whole bunch of other things. You have containers and databases and load balancing devices and infrastructure that it runs on top of. So it's more important to monitor application health as opposed to device health. But you still need to understand the difference between the application running through an overlay and the underlay. Because if you can't get a good visibility on both, you're quickly going to find yourself throwing darts in the dark like we had been before. So rather than the silos being infrastructure teams, I think the silos are quickly becoming more related to the applications themselves.
The application is king and to the business, and there's reasons for that. That's the revenue generator, keeps the business afloat, and there's a huge stack of IT technology keeping that application up and running, from networks to with physical devices and virtual devices, virtualized servers and things like that. You need visibility into that entire stack to be able to see how that application is running, especially when it's no longer inside your data center, with users being at home and applications running in the clouds and spread out like that. You need to be able to see at every level and every span across the network between user and those services.
I'm glad you said the word stack, Bruno, because I was just thinking, yeah, this is full stack monitoring, right? We've got full stack engineers now. Now we have full stack monitoring, and a lot of that is because we've gone from applications which were very static in nature, and maybe there was a load balancer in the path somewhere that might share the load over a few nodes where there was a need for scale. But now, rather than being very static resources in an application, a lot of the applications that are running, the elements are very ephemeral in nature, whether it's because they're part of like an ELB where they're being spun up on as needed for resources for scale, or because it's microservices, or because of GeoDNS, where depending on where you are, you're going somewhere else entirely. Knowing what's actually out there becomes a real challenge, and something we've had a problem with troubleshooting is when someone says, well, something's not working, we say, well, what does it normally look like? No one knows. Well, what did it look like 20 minutes ago when it was working? I don't know. Okay, well, that's kind of a challenge, right? So having something that not only can tell you, well, I can't reach it right now, so having that, a tool that not only tells you, yes, this is unavailable right now, but also says, and here's why it was available 30 minutes ago or an hour ago, and how I got there. There's a huge value in that as well. So something that goes beyond just up, down, and actually tells you how it was up or down, how I got there, and wind the clock back. Having that historical data is becoming progressively more important so that you have that deeper understanding of what's going on.
It's important to mention that it's really all about the user and the user and their ability to access the applications that they need to access. And I think that's really the critical shift that we've seen as applications become cloud-centric and varied in the way they're deployed and non-monolithic, is really understanding user experience and then tying in the elements of the network, the infrastructure, the internet, and the application itself, and how they're actually contributing to the overall user experience. A common question we get from folks that are going through SD-WAN migration projects and are trying to understand how users across their corporate environments as well as home environments are going to face the new reality and access these new applications is, how do we actually tie network latency to actual end user experience? Like, why do I care about this extra 20 millisecond of delay? And I think that's where it's really important to look at millisecond of round trip delay and correlate that to an actual application that's rendering maybe a series of web pages that a user actually needs to traverse, where a 20 millisecond delay can actually snowball into a multi-second delay on the end user's actual experience. And I think that's really has been a critical piece in tying the data across the network and infrastructure as we knew it, and tying it to the actual application user experience that we've seen.
And I think that reflects in the way people are building the applications today too, right? They're thinking about customer first and the user experience, but the fact that the infrastructure and networking, the developers are not really considering any of that. They're building microservices, and that microservice will live somewhere. It could be in the cloud, it could be in the data center. How it's deployed, it's not really up to them, it's the operations guys. And then the networking traffic about that is with the networking guys. So the fact of the matter is the application guy doesn't really know how this is going to be architected and deployed. So all he knows is, does it functionally work? And when I did my baseline, did it work correctly? Off they go, right? Then we have to be dealing with connecting the dots between all those different points of view, which is hard.
Yeah, I would add that there is a general staggering lack of understanding about the speed of light in the development community. It's one of those problems where, you know, it's like you honestly, you have data that sits in AWS in, let's say, Europe, and then you have your application users who are going to be on the other side of the world. And somewhere in the development process, no one figured, well, how is this going to work? And what's going to happen when I actually move out of my dev environment, which was in Europe, and I actually put my users on the other end of that latency, and suddenly everything goes wrong. And again, that's one of those little components. That's one of those many little pieces of the transactional pieces that falls apart. Yeah, and that should come up as part of performance engineering is before you launch an application, but it frequently doesn't. And I think that's kind of fallen into network monitoring and troubleshooting. That's kind of become part of, you know, modern application troubleshooting has become between the ops, you know, between DevOps and NetOps, if you like, has become, we'll figure out where all this latency came from. We'll figure out why the app's broken, and it can be all over the place. So,
well, John, you bring up a great point there too. You know, in a previous life, I actually worked with a large international company, and we had a lot of data centers that resided in one of the Scandinavian countries, and we had a lot of users in the U.S. And you know, when users began complaining, it was really easy to go, "Oh, well, look at that latency." But the reality is latency had already been there, and it kind of goes back to you know, to what was stated earlier, is there has to be that understanding of what is normal for the application and what has actually changed to cause the things to break. Because if there's always a 40 milliseconds of latency, you know, and there's still 40 milliseconds of latency, that 40 milliseconds of latency probably isn't your problem. There's probably something else. But if you don't have that really kind of top-down view that's giving you a clear understanding of what's normal, and what was it like, as I think you said earlier, when things were good, it's really hard to then say, okay, what's changed now that it's bad. So that's one of those key things of sometimes the numbers legitimately look bad, but that's not the problem. That, you know, a high latency does not equal, you know, problem found. So that's one of those things too that really kind of goes into this monitoring aspect. We have to understand what normal is so that we know when things break what abnormal looks like.
And I think one of the other things that have changed there is when you're talking about 20 milliseconds of latency or 40 milliseconds of additional latency causing all kinds of problems. You can no longer get away with doing a 15-minute or even a 5-minute SNMP poll. That's where your network monitoring or application monitoring actually needs to go out and probe and test all those devices in between to see what that response time is and make sure it's up and running. It can't just be passive polling.
And to be fair, you know, applications today, many great applications are written with certain level of latency variation to be expected and be able to handle that, especially for real-time applications, right? You need to be able to handle dynamic nature of how users connect to applications. However, you know, we've seen this as a really interesting scenario last year where we were working with a customer and they were having problems with the real-time application, and there had users in Dallas trying to connect to the application, which generally is hosted in San Jose for media bridging. For a few weeks, you know, there had bad performance. We worked with them to try to understand the sort of the end-to-end. Realized traffic was actually traversing because of their BGP peer with their corporate ISP. They were actually transiting through an ISP in London to go back to San Jose. And that actually was actually the steady state for 2 weeks. the application, the real-time application was actually able to handle the additional latency going through London. But the only reason it became worse is because there was a transatlantic cable cut that all of a sudden caused a user performance problem. And so you have application traffic that is being served, things change, applications adapt. But when other dependencies that may be completely out of the realm of what you think is even possible, surfaces, that's when kind of have to scratch your head, and you need the right tool sets to be able to diagnose those types of issues.
I think you hit on users again, and user experience, especially during the pandemic, the user experience expectation is greater than ever before. And so user experience, that's end user experience, they expect that application to run and run smoothly. And so application and network monitoring combined are so important. And that combined network or integrated network and application monitoring together makes for a better experience for the network engineer, the security engineer, the application engineer. They can get things done more quickly. They have a single place to look for the monitoring. And if you can free that staff up from spending 45 to 50% of their time on day-to-day tasks, then they have more time for innovation and new projects and doing better things and serving the business. So a great user experience, both for the end user as well as the engineer, very important today.
Yeah, and this is why, I mean, even at its most basic, even running, I hate to say like IPSLA monitoring, but some kind of synthetic transactions in your network, and I realize that's really trivial, but we've talked about with Thousand Eyes actually doing real transaction monitoring, but that kind of thing is exactly why it's so important. You're absolutely right. Is actually, okay, what is a user actually seeing over the internet, getting to this application and getting a page down? What's that experience like? Because I don't care what my stats look like. At the end of the day, if the actual page comes down slow, it doesn't matter. The experience sucks. It's 50% worse today than it was yesterday. I know they're going to be complaining, right? Or at least if they phone up and tell me it sucks today, I'd like to be able to look at it and go, you know what, it's exactly the same today as it was yesterday. Maybe there's something going on with them, not with the app. And understanding that experience is so helpful.
John, we don't want to be the last ones to know when something's down either. We want to keep elements active so that we know when things are looking bad, so that we can prevent it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think it sounds like that the premise is absolutely true, because when you think of traditional network monitoring tools, they're good at monitoring traditional things. It's not much different than any of the tools that you have around your house. If your house is old enough and it only has slotted screws, and you start buying a whole bunch of new things that have Phillips head screws on them, you need to buy a new screwdriver. Could you make the old one work? Yeah, but you're definitely not going to be able to get what you want out of it. And in a world where we live with containerized applications that run in clouds and multi-clouds all over the place, with a distributed workforce that relies more and more on the transit between the data center and the cloud, we really have to go back and re-examine the tools that we use. And there are tools like the ones from Cisco, AppDynamics and Thousand Eyes, which give us the kind of visibility that we need into these pieces, whether they're infrastructure, transit, or application software. And if we don't have that visibility, we're constantly going to be playing catch up. We're going to be the last people to know, and we're going to be the first people to get blamed. And that ultimately is why we need to make sure that we're reassessing what we're doing and finding the best way to serve our users and serve our operations teams. That'll just about do it for this episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable. I want to thank our guests, including our special guests from Cisco, for bringing you this podcast. If you would like to learn more information about the On-Premise IT Roundtable, please make sure you head over to gestaltit.com/podcast. You'll always find the latest version there. You can also subscribe in your favorite podcast application of choice, including iTunes. And we'd like for you to leave us a rating and a review. That helps folks that are looking for new things to listen to know what they're getting themselves into. Hopefully they'll subscribe as well, and maybe they could even suggest a premise for a future episode. But for now, for our great guests, for our host at Cisco, and for all of our Gestalt IT community, I want to thank you very much for tuning in. And we will be bringing you another episode soon.